She was 44 years old, and she had exactly $11 to her name when the Bank of Coldwater Ridge nailed a foreclosure notice to the door of the only home she had left. The man who did it was named Elias Fennick, president of the Coldwater Ridge Trust, and he did it because her late husband's debts had outlived him in grief. As it turns out, is not accepted as currency. What she had, after the house was gone and the tools were sold, and the last of the neighbors stopped meeting her eyes on the street, was $11 folded into a handkerchief and a wagon that groaned like an old dog every time the wheels turned. With that $11, she paid for a plot of scorched, sunken ground on the edge of town that had once been Tanner's Forge, a blacksmith shop that had burned 3 years before and never been rebuilt, its chimney standing over the wreckage like a tombstone nobody had bothered to carve a name into. Everyone in Coldwater Ridge said it was a foolish purchase, ash and ruin for a woman with nothing left to lose and nothing left to build with. But beneath that cold ash pit, buried where the forge fire had once burned hottest, was something that would not only change the shape of her life, but would answer a question this town had been quietly, achingly asking for 3 long years. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Marguerite Voss. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, overlooked, or written off by everyone around you, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We read everyone. Marguerite Voss had been born in 1841 in a river town in Missouri, the third daughter of a wheelwright named Josiah and a quiet, broad-shouldered man who believed that anything broken could be mended if you were patient enough to understand why it had broken in the first place. Her mother, Ruth, had died when Marguerite was 9, leaving Josiah to raise 3 girls alone in a workshop that smelled of pine shavings and hot iron, and it was there, among the wheel rims and the axle grease, that Marguerite learned the 2 things that would define the whole of her life. The first was a trade. Her father did not believe that daughters should be kept from the forge fire simply because the world preferred them in kitchens, and so by the time she was 12, Marguerite could shape a wagon tire, true a wheel, and read the temper of hot metal by its color alone, a skill so rare in a woman of her era that traveling peddlers sometimes stopped simply to watch her work, disbelieving what their own eyes told them. The second thing she learned was a kind of patient faith, not the kind found only in church pews, though she had that too, but a working faith that value did not announce itself loudly. Her father used to say that the best iron in the world looked like ordinary rock until you knew what to do with it, and that a person who judged only by the surface of things would spend their whole life walking past treasure without ever once bending down to look closer. It was a lesson she carried away other women carried a locket, quietly, close to the chest, taken out and turned over whenever the world gave her reason to doubt it. She married young, at 19, to a gentle, restless man named Thomas Voss, a surveyor's assistant who had passed through her father's shop needing an axle repaired and left 3 months later needing very little at all except a company for the rest of his life. Thomas was not a wealthy man, nor an ambitious one in the way the age demanded, but he was a kind one, and when he was offered a position helping to survey new rail spurs into the Kansas territories, Marguerite packed what little they owned and followed him west without a single backward glance, believing, as her father had taught her, that a life built on patience and honest work would eventually yield its worth. They settled in Coldwater Ridge in 1867, when the town was little more than a rail depot, a general store, and a scattering of hopeful, sunburned families waiting to see if the railroad would make good on its promises. Thomas found steady work with a surveying company. Marguerite, unable to run her own forge in a town that was not yet ready to accept such a thing from a woman, quietly kept house, took in mending, and taught herself the account books for 3 of the town's small businesses, because numbers, like iron, did not lie to you if you knew how to read them honestly. She and Thomas never had children of their own, a private sorrow they carried together without ever letting it sour the tenderness between them, and instead they poured themselves into the town itself, into its church suppers and its harvest dances and its slow, unglamorous growth from a depot into a real community with a name people said with a certain pride. It was Amos Tanner, the town's blacksmith, who became their closest friend in those years, a broad, laughing man with hands like cured leather and a habit of humming old hymns off-key while he worked. Amos ran the only forge for 30 miles, and Thomas, drawn by the smell of hot iron that reminded him faintly of his wife's father's shop, spent many evenings there simply talking, and Marguerite, when Amos's own hand grew too stiff with age to manage the finer work, would sometimes step into the forge herself, in full view of a town that had, by then, come to respect her too much to comment on it. Amos had no family of his own. his wife having passed young and no children ever coming, and in the particular way of small frontier towns, he became something like an uncle to Marguerite and Thomas both, a fixture at their table on Sundays, a man who called Marguerite the finest smith in 3 counties who never got to prove it, and meant it with real affection. It was Amos who first told Marguerite, half in jest and half in something more serious, that if anything ever happened to him, the forge ought to go to someone who understood that iron was not just iron, but a kind of memory, holding the shape of everything it had ever been asked to become. She had laughed it off at the time. She would remember those words for the rest of her life. The fool, when it came slowly and then all at once, the way ruin so often does. Thomas died in the winter of 1883, thrown from his horse on a surveying trip through a sudden ice storm in the hill country north of town, and Marguerite buried him in the small cemetery behind the church with a grief so total that for a season she could hardly remember how to hold a pen, let alone balance a ledger. Amos Tanner, already elderly by then, had passed 2 years before Thomas, his forge sitting quiet and untended, inherited by a nephew back east who had no interest in blacksmithing and even less in Cold Water Ridge, and who simply let the building stand empty, its tools slowly rusting, until a lightning fire in the dry summer of 1884 took the roof, the walls, and most of what remained inside, leaving only the stone chimney and a scorched, sunken pit where the forge fire had once burned. Marguerite, widowed and grieving, had leaned on what savings she and Thomas had kept, modest as they were, and it might have been enough to see her through, had it not been for a debt she did not even know existed until the letter arrived. Thomas, it turned out, had co-signed a loan for a struggling rail contractor 2 years before his death, a kindness extended to a man he considered a friend. And when that contractor's business collapsed and the man himself vanished west without a trace, the full weight of the debt fell to his widow, Elias Fennick, who had taken over the Cold Water Ridge Trust from his more patient father, showed her no particular cruelty, only the cold, procedural cruelty of a man who believed sentiment had no place in banking. Within 18 months, the house was gone, the furniture sold piece by piece to cover what the house's sale had not, and Marguerite was, 4 years old, found herself standing on the boardwalk outside the bank with a handkerchief holding $11, watching her own front door recede behind Elias Fennick's polite, unmoved smile. She did not weep in front of him. Her father had taught her that too, that dignity was sometimes the only tool left in the box, and it still cut if you held it right. What she did instead, over the following days, was walk the length of Cold Water Ridge with her $11 in her wagon, looking for something, anything, that might let her stand on her own 2 feet again, a woman past her middle years with a trade too unusual for polite employment, and a grief still raw enough to ache with each cold morning. It was on the 3rd day that she found herself standing at the edge of what had been Tanner's forge, the burned lot that the town had simply left alone for 3 years, weeds pushing up through the scorched earth, the old chimney standing crooked and blackened against the sky. The county, it turned out, had quietly taken possession of the lot after Amos's nephew failed to pay the back taxes, and the clerk at the land office, a tired, kindly man named Otis Grubb, told her she could have a whole parcel, ruin and all, for $4, simply to be rid of the paperwork. It was, by any sensible measure, a foolish purchase, ash and collapsed timber and a chimney that might come down in the next hard wind. But Marguerite thought of Amos Tanner humming his off-key hymns, of her father's rough hands turning hot iron the color of a sunset, and she paid the $4 without a moment's hesitation, leaving her with $7 in a burned lot that the whole town, watching from their windows and their porches, quietly agreed marked the final, sad chapter of a once respectable woman's decline. She began clearing the lot herself, because there was no one to pay to do it for her, working from first light with a borrowed shovel in her own 2 capable hands, hauling away burned timber and broken brick in her old wagon, load by load, while the town watched with a particular blend of pity and discomfort that people reserve for those whose misfortune reminds them uncomfortably of their own fragility. It was on the 4th day of clearing, while working to level the collapsed remains of the old forge floor, that her shovel struck something that was not stone and was not charred wood, something with a dull, deliberate resonance that made her pause and kneel in the ash to dig with her bare hands. What she found, buried perhaps 18 inches beneath where the forge ash pit had always been, was a flat iron box, its hinges rusted nearly solid, sealed with a simple hasp lock that had somehow survived both the burial and the fire above it untouched, protected, she would later realize, by the very ash that had seemed to bury it in ruin. She sat back on her heels in the failing light, her hands black with soot, and stared at the box for a long moment before she understood, with a certainty that raised a hair on her arms, that Amos Tanner had buried this himself, deliberately, beneath the floor of his own forge, in a place he must have believed only the right person would ever think to dig. It took her the better part of an hour, working with a chisel borrowed from her own dwindling tools, to break the rusted lock without destroying whatever lay inside, and when the lid finally gave way with a groan of protesting metal, what she found inside was not gold, not the buried fortune the town might have imagined, but something that would prove, in the end, to matter far more. There was a leather ledger book, its pages fox but legible, filled in Amos Tanner's own careful, blocky handwriting, and beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp, a bundle of deeds and promissory notes, and a letter addressed, in faded ink, simply to whoever finds this and understands what it means. Marguerite read the letter first, there in the ash by lantern light, her hands trembling not from cold but from something closer to recognition, and what Amos had written explained everything and nothing all at once, a puzzle whose full shape she would only understand over the days that followed. Amos Tanner, it turned out, had spent the better part of his working life not just shoeing horses and mending wagon wheels, but quietly, patiently buying up small parcels of land and forgiving debts owed to him by struggling families throughout the county, debts he recorded not to collect but simply to remember, and land he purchased not to profit from but to hold in trust against a day he seemed, even then, to have feared might come. The ledger was a record of nearly 2 decades of quiet generosity, listing families across Coldwater Ridge and surrounding valley who had, at one time or another, been unable to pay for Amos's work and whom he had simply forgiven, along with dates, amounts, and small, humanizing notes in the margins. The Hendricks boys' leg still healing, no charge, Widow Larkspur's mule, paid in eggs and gratitude, which is enough. But it was the deeds that made Marguerite's breath catch, because among them, carefully folded and marked in Amos's hand as the one that matters most, was the original deed to a parcel of land just north of town, 60 acres of good bottomland along Coldwater Creek that Amos had quietly purchased some 15 years before from a struggling homesteading family named Okafor. Freed people who had come west after the war seeking the same promise of land and dignity that had drawn everyone else to the frontier, and who had been swindled out of their claim by a crooked land agent working, the ledger made painfully clear, in loose partnership with none other than Elias Fenwick's own father, the previous president of the Coldwater Ridge Trust. Amos had bought the land back quietly at auction, intending, his letter explained, to see it restored to the Okafor family or their descendants once he could locate them, a search the ledger showed he had pursued for years without success before his death, the family having scattered after their loss, their whereabouts lost to time and grief. Marguerite sat with that letter until the lantern burned low, understanding now why Amos had told her, half in jest, that the forge ought to go to someone who understood iron as memory. He had buried this ledger not as treasure but as a trust, a responsibility, and some part of him, she felt certain, had believed that if the right person ever came looking, ever cared enough to dig through the ash of what looked like ruin, there would be the one to finish what he could not. It was, she realized with a weight that settled somewhere deep in her chest, both a gift and an obligation, and she was not at all certain she was equal to it. But she thought of her father's hands, and of Thomas's quiet kindness, and of Amos himself, humming hymns off-key while he worked, and she folded the letter carefully back into the oilcloth and resolved, there in the ash by lantern light, that she would not let this discovery simply enrich her and end there. The land was worth a great deal, worth more now than it had been 15 years before, with the rail spur having finally reached the valley and bottomland along the creek having become some of the most valuable ground in the county, valuable enough, she understood with a cold clarity, that Elias Fenwick's bank held a significant and quietly profitable lien against it under its current, disputed ownership, a lien that would evaporate entirely if the original theft were ever exposed. Word travels quickly in a small town, and it did not take long for Elias Fenwick to hear that the widow Voss had found something in the ashes of Tanner's old forge, though what exactly she had found remained, for a time, her own closely guarded secret. She spent the following weeks working carefully and quietly, first writing to the county land office in the territorial capital to confirm the history of the Okafor claim, and then, with Otis Grubb's help, tracing what records existed of the family's movements after their loss, a trail that led, after several dead ends and no small amount of patient correspondence, to a small town in Nebraska where a woman named the Dees Okafor Reeves, granddaughter of the original claimants, now kept a boarding house with her husband, having grown up hearing her grandmother's stories of the good bottomland they had lost to a dishonest agent's paper tricks. Marguerite wrote to her carefully, enclosing a copy of Amos's ledger entry in the original deed, and the letter that came back, 3 weeks later, was blotted in places where tears had clearly fallen upon the ink, a letter that thanked her for a kindness the family had long since stopped believing possible. It was around this same time that Elias Fenwick, having heard enough rumor to grow uneasy, paid Marguerite a visit at the forge lot, finding her at work rebuilding the old chimney's base with bricks she had salvaged and cleaned herself. He was polite in a way that men of his particular power are always polite when they sense a threat they cannot yet name, and he inquired, with careful casualness, what exactly it was she had found in the old ash pit, offering, with an equally careful casualness, to purchase a forge lot back from her at a generous price, more than double what she had paid, should she find the burden of ownership too great for a woman alone. Marguerite, wiping brick dust from her hands, told him with perfect calm that she had found precisely what she had been looking for her whole life, though she did not yet say what that was, and she watched something flicker behind his composed features, a recognition, perhaps, that whatever she had found was not something $4 could easily undo. The conflict that followed was not loud, not the stuff of gunfights or shouted accusations in the street, but the quieter, more insidious conflict of a man with power attempting to protect a secret his own father had left buried. Fenwick began, subtly at first, to make things difficult for her, calling in a small remaining note on tools she had bought on credit to rebuild the forge, spreading a quiet word among the town's merchants that the widow Voss's finances were not to be trusted, that whatever she claimed to have found was likely nothing more than an old fool's fantasy, a woman grieving her way toward delusion. Some in town believed him, or wanted to, because it was easier to believe a grieving widow had lost her sense than to believe that a family's land had been stolen with the quiet complicity of the institution they all depended upon. But others, remembering Amos Tanner's genuine kindness over the years, remembering Marguerite's own quiet steadiness through her grief, began instead to ask questions, and questions, once asked in a small town, have a way of finding their own answers. Otis Grubb, moved by what he had read in Amos's careful ledger, quietly confirmed to anyone who asked that the original land records had indeed show an irregularity in the Okafor claims transfer, an irregularity that had never, in 15 years, been properly explained. Matters came to a head at a town meeting called, ironically enough, by Fenwick himself, ostensibly to discuss the rail spay's expansion but transparently intended to publicly discredit Marguerite before her claims could gain further traction. He stood before the gathered town, confident in the authority his position had always afforded him, and suggested, with careful, wounding gentleness, that the widow Voss's recent behavior, digging in ash pits, writing to strangers in Nebraska, spinning stories of buried ledgers, suggested a mind unsettled by grief, a woman perhaps in need of quiet rest rather than continued involvement in the town's affairs. It was, Marguerite would later reflect, the moment Amos Tanner's trust in her was finally fully tested, and she rose from her seat in the crowded meeting hall with the same steadiness her father had taught her at a forge fire a decade before, and she did not raise her voice, because she did not need to. She read aloud, instead, from Amos's own ledger, in his own handwriting, the entry recording the purchase of the Okafor land, the notation of the crooked agent's involvement, and beside it, in a hand the whole room recognized as belonging to the bank's own previous president, a faded pencil note confirming the arrangement's true nature. The silence that followed was total, the kind of silence that falls over a room when a town realizes, all at once, that a story it had comfortably told itself for 15 years was not, after all, entirely true. The restoration that followed was neither swift nor without difficulty, but it was, in the end, complete. With Otis Grubb's official confirmation of the land records and the overwhelming weight of Amos's careful documentation, the disputed lien on the 60 acres was formally dissolved, and Adiz Okafor Reeves traveled from Nebraska that autumn to stand upon her grandmother's land for the first time in her own living memory, weeping openly in a way that Marguerite, watching from a respectful distance, understood completely, having wept in much the same way beside Thomas's grave not so long before. The Okafor family did not simply reclaim the land in cold silence, moved by Marguerite's own sacrifice and the story of Amos Tanner's quiet, decades-long faithfulness. They insisted on granting her a portion of the bottomland outright, enough that she was able, at last, to rebuild not just a forge but a small home beside it, and enough besides that she was able to establish, with the rest a modest fund, administered jointly with a deed from a distance, to help other families in the valley, who found themselves, as she once had, standing outside with nothing but a folded handkerchief and a debt that was never truly theirs to carry. Elias Fenwick faced no dramatic punishment, no mob justice or public ruin, only the slow, grinding accountability of a territorial land office investigation into his father's old dealings in the bank board, made uneasy by scandal, that quietly eased him from his position within the year, replaced by a younger, more careful man who kept Amos Tanner's old ledger, at Marguerite's insistence, displayed under glass in the bank's front office, a permanent reminder that value, once buried, does not stay buried forever. And so it was that a woman who had stood on a boardwalk with $11 and no home to call her own became, within the space of a single year, the rebuilder of the finest forge in 3 counties, exactly as Amos Tanner had once teased she might be, and the quiet architect of a justice 15 years delayed but no less complete for its patience. Marguerite Voss had lost her husband, her home, and very nearly her faith in a world that seemed determined to measure her worth by what remained in her pockets rather than what remained in her hands and her heart. But she had learned, at her father's forge fire long before any of this began, that the best iron in the world looks like ordinary rock until someone patient enough bends down to look closer, and that the ash left behind by disaster is very often simply protecting something that was never truly lost, only waiting, in the dark and the cold, for the one person who would think to dig. When she stood now at the rebuilt forge, hammer in hand, shaping hot iron the color of a sunset exactly as her father had taught her, she often thought of Amos Tanner's off-key humming, of Thomas's gentle kindness, of Adi's Okafor reeds weeping in the bottomland grass, and she understood, with a certainty that no bank foreclosure could ever again take from her, that she had not simply survived her ruin. She had, in the truest sense her father would have recognized, mended it. Thank you for sitting with Marguerite Voss's story tonight, and for staying with us through every ember and every quiet reckoning it took to bring her home. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you. Has there ever been a time in your own life when you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off, a place, an object, or perhaps even a person? Tell us about it in the comments below. We read every single one, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear tonight. If this story moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who could use a reminder that nothing valuable is ever truly lost, only waiting to be found by the right patient hands. Until next time, stay close.